You came to my castle for shelter, and you have nothing to offer. Give her the lowest room.
The laughter started before the door even shut. It rolled through the great stone hall like cold steel scraping across glass, sharp and careless. Alira Snow stood in the center of the corridor, her thin cloak still damp with melting snow from the storm outside. Her boots were worn, the leather cracked from miles of winter travel, and strands of dark hair clung to her face where ice had begun to thaw. She did not move. She did not speak. In front of her stood the man who ruled the mountains, the Alpha King of Ironfang. Halvar Drakenfell watched her with the distant calm of a predator, deciding whether something before him was worth killing or ignoring. His silver eyes slid over her slowly, taking in the travel-stained cloak, the trembling hands she tried to keep steady, the quiet way she held herself, despite the mocking whispers around them. "Is this the woman who asks sanctuary?" he asked. His voice was low, controlled, carrying across the chamber without effort. Captain Rydrick, Falcon stepped forward. His armor shifted softly as he bowed his head. "She arrived at the outer gates just before dawn, Your Majesty, alone. No packmark, no escort, no explanation." Murmurs rippled through the watching wolves. Nobles leaned against pillars. Warriors stood along the walls. Everyone stared at the strange woman who had appeared in the middle of winter, asking protection from the most powerful Alpha in the north. Alira kept her eyes lowered until the king spoke again. "Look at me." She raised her head. The moment their eyes met, the room seemed to tighten. Halvar was tall, broad-shouldered, the weight of command resting easily on him. His dark coat was trimmed with black fur, the symbol of his rank worked in silver across the chest. He smelled faintly of iron and pine, danger wrapped in quiet discipline. He studied her for a long moment. Something flickered briefly across his expression, then it vanished. "You come to my castle with nothing," he said. "No name worth recognition, no pack allegiance, no offering, and you expect sanctuary." Alira's voice was soft but steady. "I offer truth." Laughter burst from several nobles along the wall. Halvar's mouth curved faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Truth," he repeated. "That is rarely useful in politics." From the steps beside the throne, Lady Velmira Corvain glided forward. Her red gown shimmered like spilled wine under the torchlight, and her eyes gleamed with quiet amusement as she looked Alira over. "Your Majesty," she said sweetly, "surely the castle cannot become a shelter for every wandering girl who stumbles through the snow." A few wolves chuckled openly now. Velmira tilted her head slightly. "Look at her. She barely appears strong enough to survive winter. What could she possibly offer the Ironfang pack?" Alira said nothing. Halvar's gaze never left her face. The silence stretched just long enough to make several people uncomfortable. Finally, he turned slightly toward Captain Falcon. "Are all the castle chambers occupied?" "No, Your Majesty." Halvar paused. Then he spoke in a tone so calm it carried more cruelty than anger ever could. "Give her the lowest room." The reaction was immediate. A ripple of amusement swept through the hall. The lowest room was not a place given to guests. It was a cold stone chamber beneath the castle foundations, where servants slept during winter storms, and prisoners were sometimes left overnight when cells were full. Velmira's lips curved in quiet satisfaction. Halvar looked back at Alira. "You may stay," he said flatly, "or you may leave. It makes no difference to me." For a moment, Alira's fingers tightened around the strap of the small satchel resting against her side. It looked like she might speak. Instead, she simply nodded once. Captain Falcon gestured toward the stairway leading down through the castle. 2 guards stepped forward. "This way." Alira walked past the watching wolves. The whispers followed her like smoke. "She won't last the night." Probably a spy. Or a beggar. The king should have turned her away. She said nothing as she descended the narrow stairs into the colder levels of the castle. The chamber they gave her was worse than the rumors suggested. The stone walls sweated with frost. A narrow bed sat against one wall, the thin mattress sagging from years of use. A cracked window near the ceiling let winter winds slip through the gaps in the stone. The guards left immediately after unlocking the door. Their footsteps faded. Silence settled over the small room. Alira remained standing for a long moment, breathing slowly as the exhaustion of the journey pressed heavily against her body. Then she moved toward the bed and sat carefully. Her finger slipped inside the satchel at her side. She drew out a bundle wrapped in thick wool. The bundle shifted. A small hand pushed weakly through the folds. A boy's voice whispered from inside the blanket. "Are we safe?" Alira's throat tightened. She brushed the child's dark curls gently away from his face. Kieran Snow was only 5 years old, thin from the long journey, his eyes too serious for someone so young. "For now," she whispered. The wind outside the castle wailed across the mountains. Kieran looked up at her with quiet worry. "You said the Alpha King was strong." "He is." "Then why can't we trust him?" Alira looked toward the small, cracked window, where faint torchlight from the courtyard glowed through the frost. Somewhere above them, laughter still echoed through the great hall. Her voice dropped to a quiet murmur. "Because kings rarely see what stands in front of them." Kieran slowly drifted to sleep in her arms. Hours passed. The castle above grew quiet. The last voices faded. Torches dimmed along the corridors. When the moon rose high above the mountains, Alira stood. Carefully, she wrapped the boy back inside the blanket and lifted him against her shoulder. He stirred but did not wake. She opened the door. The hallway beyond was empty. No guards, no servants, only shadows stretching along the cold stone floor. Alira moved silently through the corridor and up the narrow stairwell. When she reached the outer gate, the storm had nearly erased the tracks in the snow. She stepped into the freezing night, and before dawn touched the castle walls, she disappeared into the forest. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the mountains wrapped in sharp winter sunlight. Snow covered the valley below the Iron Fang Castle like a field of silver glass. Inside the courtyard, warriors were already training. Wooden blades struck together with dull cracks. Orders echoed across the stone walls as soldiers moved through drills beneath the watch of their commanders. Alpha King Halvar Draconfell stood on the high balcony overlooking the courtyard. His arms rested against the stone railing, but his attention was not on the warriors below. Prince Soren Draconfell stepped beside him, studying his brother's distant expression. "You look troubled," Soren said lazily. Halvar did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the distant forest stretching across the mountain slopes. "The woman who arrived last night," he said finally. Soren smirked faintly. "The stray?" Halvar turned slightly. "Where is she?" Soren shrugged. "Still freezing in that cellar, I imagine." Halvar's eyes hardened. "You imagine?" Soren frowned slightly and signaled to a servant passing across the balcony. "Bring Captain Falcon." A few minutes later, the captain approached, bowing his head respectfully. Halvar spoke without preamble. "Bring the woman who arrived last night." Falcon hesitated. The pause was small but unmistakable. Halvar's voice lowered. "Explain." Falcon cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, the chamber is empty." Silence spread across the balcony. "Empty?" Halvar repeated. "Yes, sire. The guards reported that she was gone before dawn." Prince Soren let out a short laugh. "Then she had more sense than we gave her credit for. She ran." Halvar did not laugh. Something inside his chest had shifted the moment Falcon spoke. A strange tension coiled beneath his ribs. "Search the castle," he ordered quietly. Falcon nodded. "We already have. No one saw her leave. The storm erased the tracks outside the gate." Soren leaned against the railing with mild amusement. So the problem solved itself. Halvar's eyes moved slowly toward the forest beyond the castle walls. The morning wind carried the scent of pine and frost across the balcony. Beneath it was something else, something faint, something that stirred the wolf inside him with sudden, violent awareness. His jaw tightened. "Send riders," he said. Soren blinked. "For what?" Halvar turned toward him, the look in his silver eyes wiped. The smirk from Soren's face, instantly. "Find the woman who slept in this castle last night." Soren stared at him. "You're serious?" Halvar's voice was colder than the winter wind. "She walked out of my castle." His gaze drifted again toward the forest where the mountains fell away into endless white wilderness. Something about the air felt unfinished, unresolved, like a scent he should recognize but could not quite grasp. "Find her," he said again. Far beyond the castle walls, deep in the frozen forest, lay snow. Walked through the snow with the sleeping child wrapped against her chest, unaware that the king who had dismissed her hours earlier had already begun searching for the woman he had failed to see. The riders left the castle before the sun climbed over the eastern ridge. Hooves struck frozen earth as 12 wolves in heavy cloaks rode out through the iron gates of Ironfang. Captain Rydrick Falcon led them, his sharp eyes scanning the snowfields for any sign the storm had failed to erase. But the mountain winds had been ruthless. The snow was smooth and untouched, stretching across the valley like a blank page. Falcon cursed quietly under his breath. By all logic, the woman should have left a trail. A traveler carrying a child through deep snow could not simply vanish, yet the ground revealed nothing. From the balcony above the courtyard, Halvar Drakenfell watched the riders disappear into the forest. The cold air bit against his face, but he barely noticed it. Something restless had taken hold of him since dawn. It sat beneath his ribs like a wolf pacing inside a cage. Prince Soren leaned against the stone railing nearby, studying his brother carefully. "You've chased enemies less fiercely than this," Soren said. Halvar did not look at him. "She walked into my castle in the middle of winter." "Yes." "And she walked out again before sunrise." Soren shrugged lightly. "Perhaps she realized it was not a wise place to. Stay." Halvar's gaze drifted toward the mountains. "No," he said quietly. "She left because I told her she meant nothing." Soren raised an eyebrow at that, but before he could answer, the king turned away and descended the stone steps back into the castle. Inside the great hall, Lady Velmira Corvain stood near the throne, speaking with several noble families. Her smile faded slightly when she saw Halvar enter with his usual commanding stride. "Your Majesty," she said smoothly, "the morning council waits." Halvar walked past her without slowing. "Postpone it." Velmira blinked in surprise. "Postpone it." Halvar's voice was calm but final. "Until tomorrow." The nobles exchanged confused glances as the king left the hall again. Velmira watched him go, suspicion creeping into her expression. Something had shifted. She could feel it. Beyond the castle walls, the winter forest swallowed Alira Snow whole. Snow clung to the branches of towering pines, and the wind carried thin whispers through the frozen trees. Alira moved steadily through the forest, her steps careful but determined, as she carried Kieran against her chest beneath the wool cloak. The boy slept heavily, his breath warm against her collarbone. Hours had passed since they left the castle. The cold had settled deep into her bones, but she did not stop walking. She knew the riders would come eventually. Kings rarely let strangers leave their territory without questions. She had hoped to gain a few days' head start before Halvar Drakenfell noticed her absence. But something in the king's silver eyes had unsettled her last night. Something observant, something dangerous. By midday, the forest thickened around her, the path narrowing between the rocky slopes. Alira slowed slightly as the wind shifted direction. Her senses sharpened instantly. Wolves. Not Ironfang wolves. These scents were rougher, hungrier, like smoke from a fire burning too hot. Rogue wolves. Alira's heartbeat quickened. She adjusted Kieran carefully and moved off the trail toward thicker brush. The forest fell silent around her as she slipped behind a cluster of frost-covered trees. Moments later, 3 figures emerged from the trees ahead. Their cloaks were dark and ragged, their movements loose with the careless confidence of predators who feared no law. One of them sniffed the air slowly. "Someone passed through here," he muttered. Another wolf laughed softly. "Probably a traveler. Easy prey." Alira remained perfectly still behind the trees, her breath shallow. Kieran stirred slightly against her shoulder, and her fingers tightened protectively around him. The rogues stepped closer, their boots crunching through snow as they followed the faint trail she had left minutes earlier. One of them crouched, studying the disturbed snow. "Fresh," he said. The leader's eyes narrowed. "Then we hunt." Far away in the mountains, Halvar suddenly stopped walking in the middle of the corridor leading to the armory. The sensation hit him like a blade sliding under his ribs. His wolf stirred violently, pushing forward with an urgency he could not explain. He turned sharply toward the forest beyond the castle walls. A scent seemed to linger in his memory. Snow, pine, and something soft beneath it, like wildflowers buried beneath winter frost. Halvar exhaled slowly. Then realization struck him with quiet force. "Mate," he murmured. The word felt heavy in the air. Prince Soren had followed him into the corridor and stopped short when he heard it. "You can't be serious." Halvar's expression darkened. "I felt it this morning." Soren crossed his arms, studying his brother carefully. "You felt something. That doesn't mean—" Halvar cut him off with a sharp glance. "Send more riders." Soren sighed. "If Velmira hears about this—" "I don't care what Velmira hears." The king's voice was cold as winter steel. "Find her." Deep in the forest, the rogue wolves were almost upon Alira. One of them stepped through the brush, his sharp eyes scanning the trees. "I smell a child," he said slowly. A cruel smile spread across his face. Alira knew she could not outrun them, not while carrying Kieran. Her gaze lifted toward the mountains beyond the trees. Somewhere behind those peaks stood the castle she had just escaped. Somewhere behind her rode the Alpha King who had dismissed her like a beggar. And somewhere in the shadows of the forest waited enemies far more dangerous. The rogues stepped closer. Snow crunched beneath their boots. Alira shifted her stance quietly, placing herself between the wolves and the sleeping child. The first rogue lunged forward through the trees, and the moment he did, Alira moved. The rogue expected fear. What he found instead was speed. Alira moved like a shadow snapping to life. The moment the wolf lunged, she twisted aside and drove her elbow into his throat with brutal precision. The impact knocked the air from his lungs and sent him crashing backward into the snow. The other two rogues froze in surprise. A woman traveling alone with a child was not supposed to fight like that. The second wolf snarled and rushed forward. Alira shifted her weight, protecting Kieran with one arm as she struck again. Her fist slammed into the wolf's jaw with sharp force. Bone cracked. The rogue stumbled, blood spraying across the white snow. The third wolf circled slowly now, eyes narrowing. "You're no ordinary traveler," he growled. Alira's chest rose and fell steadily as she faced them. She had not drawn a weapon. She did not need one. Years of survival had taught her how to fight without mercy when necessary. The leader wiped blood from his mouth and laughed softly. "Even better," he said. "The Alpha will pay well for a woman like you." Alira's expression hardened. "Which Alpha?" The rogue's grin widened. "The one gathering. Wolves beyond these mountains. Driven Mordain." The name struck like a quiet thunderclap inside her mind. Driven Mordain had once been a warlord, feared across half the northern packs before he vanished into the wilderness years ago. If he was rising again now, the mountain territories would soon burn. The rogue lunged again, claws flashing as he partially shifted. Alira ducked low, spinning beneath his attack. Her foot swept out sharply, sending him crashing to the ground. She grabbed a fallen branch and drove it downward with brutal force into his shoulder. The wolf howled in pain as the wood pierced through muscle and pinned him against the frozen ground. The final rogue hesitated. Fear flickered briefly in his eyes. This woman was not prey. She was something else entirely. Behind Alira, Kieran stirred awake, his small voice whispering weakly. "Alira?" She turned her head slightly without lowering her guard. "Close your eyes." The boy obeyed instantly. The last rogue backed away slowly now, calculating the risk. "Draven will hear about this," he muttered. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the white forest. Silence settled over the clearing again. Alira exhaled slowly. Her body trembled from exhaustion now that the fight was over. She pulled the branch free and stepped away from the injured wolf struggling in the snow. Without another word, she lifted Kieran and continued walking deeper into the forest. High in the mountains, Halvard Drakenfell stood in the castle courtyard as a rider galloped through the gates. Snow sprayed beneath the horse's hooves as it skidded to a halt. The rider jumped down quickly, breathing hard. "Your Majesty," he said, "we found signs of a fight in the forest valley." Halvar's silver eyes sharpened instantly. "Blood?" "Yes." "Whose?" The rider hesitated. "We couldn't tell. But there were 3 rogue wolves nearby." Halvar's jaw tightened. Without another word, he turned toward the stables. Soren followed behind him, already shaking his head. "You're riding out personally now?" Halvar did not slow his stride. "If those rogues touched her," he said quietly, "they will not survive the day." Far away in the frozen forest, Alira Snow continued walking through the snow, unaware that the Alpha King she had left behind had finally begun to understand exactly who and what he had allowed to walk out of his castle. The forest grew darker the deeper Alira walked. Tall pines blocked most of the sunlight, leaving the snow beneath them dim and blue with shadow. Her legs ached with every step, but she kept moving. Kieran slept again against her shoulder, exhausted from the cold and the sudden violence of the encounter with the rogue wolves. Alira listened carefully to every sound around her. The shifting wind, the creak of frozen branches, the distant cry of a hawk circling above the mountains. She knew the rogues would not give up easily. Wolves like that never did. And if the one who escaped reached Draven Mordain, the forest would soon be filled with hunters. Behind her, miles away, Halvard Drakenfell rode hard through the valley. His black stallion cut through the snow like a shadow, powerful legs driving forward with relentless speed. 6 riders followed him, but none dared speak. They could feel the tension radiating from their king like heat from a forge. Halvar's wolf had grown restless the moment he entered the forest. The scent that had lingered faintly in the castle that morning now grew stronger with every mile they rode. Snow, pine, and beneath it something soft and warm that stirred instincts he had never felt before. His jaw tightened as the truth settled deeper in his chest. The stranger he had dismissed the night before was not simply a wandering woman. She was his mate. The realization filled him with a strange mixture of anger and unease. Fate had chosen the worst possible moment to reveal itself. Halvar Drakenfell had ruled Ironfang for 8 years without taking a Luna. Alliances had been offered. Noble daughters had been presented. Lady Velmira Corvain had practically claimed the position already in the minds of half the court. Yet none of them had stirred the ancient bond that bound wolf to wolf until last night. Until the moment a quiet woman with snow in her hair had walked into his hall asking sanctuary, and he had given her the coldest room in the castle. Halvar urged his horse forward faster. The rider soon reached the valley where Captain Falcon had reported signs of a fight. The snow there was disturbed, dark stains frozen into the white ground. Halvar dismounted immediately and crouched beside the marks. Claw gouges cut deep into the snow, and broken branches lay scattered across the clearing. The smell of rogue wolves lingered in the air, but another scent remained as well, faint but unmistakable. Her scent. Halvar closed his eyes briefly as his wolf surged forward, recognizing the trace instantly. She had fought here, and she had survived. His eyes opened again, sharp and cold. "She went east," he said quietly. Falcon studied the ground. "How can you tell?" Halvar rose to his feet. "Because that's the direction my wolf says she ran." Meanwhile, miles ahead, Alira had finally stopped walking. The forest opened into a narrow ravine where a frozen stream cut through the rock. She crouched beside the ice, carefully setting Kieran down on a patch of dry ground. The boy stirred and blinked awake slowly. "Are we there yet?" he murmured. Alira forced a faint smile. "Not yet." She brushed snow from his cloak and handed him a small piece of bread from her satchel. Kieran ate quietly, his eyes drifting toward the forest around them. "Those wolves. Will they come back?" he asked softly. Alira hesitated. "Maybe." Kieran lowered his voice even further. "And the king?" Alira looked toward the distant mountains behind them. Somewhere beyond those peaks rode a man powerful enough to command entire packs with a single word. The same man who had looked at her like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. "If the king finds us," she said slowly, "everything will change." Kieran frowned slightly. "Is that bad?" Alira did not answer. Back in the forest valley, Halvar mounted his horse again. The trail was faint, but the mate bond guiding him had grown stronger with every mile. He could feel her presence now like a distant pull on his instincts, urging him forward. Falcon glanced toward the king uneasily. "Your Majesty, are you certain about this?" Halvar's eyes remained fixed on the eastern forest. "Yes." "If Lady Valmira learns you left the castle chasing a stranger," Halvar's voice cut through the cold air like steel, "then she will learn that strangers sometimes matter more than courtiers." As the riders continued east, the sky began to darken, again with gathering clouds. Another storm was coming. Alira knew the storm was returning long before the first snowflake fell. The air had changed. The wind carried a heavier scent now, thick with frost and distant thunder. She wrapped Kieran's cloak tighter around his shoulders and guided him deeper into the ravine where the stone walls would shield them from the worst of the wind. The boy walked quietly beside her, his small boots crunching through the snow. For someone so young, he had learned quickly how to survive the silence of the wilderness. They reached a narrow cave carved into the rock near the frozen stream. It was little more than a shallow hollow, but it would protect them for the night. Inside the cave, Alira lit a small fire, using dry bark and twigs she had gathered earlier. The flame flickered weakly at first, before growing stronger, casting warm orange light across the stone walls. Kieran sat close to the fire, rubbing his cold hands together. "Will we stay here tonight?" he asked. Alira nodded. "Only until morning." She studied the entrance of the cave carefully, listening to the wind howling outside. Her instincts told her they were no longer alone in the forest. The rogue wolves would not be the only hunters searching now. The Iron Fang riders would come as well. Kieran looked up at her again, curiosity shining in his eyes. "Why didn't you tell the king the truth?" The question struck deeper than he realized. Alira stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Because if I told him the truth," she said quietly, "he would never have let us leave the castle." The boy tilted his head slightly. "But isn't that what we wanted?" Alira shook her head slowly. "No," Kieran frowned. "Why not?" Alira hesitated again. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing a shadow of something older than fear, something heavier. "Because some truths start wars," she said softly. Outside the cave, the wind carried a distant sound through the trees. Hooves, many of them. Halvar Dreckenfell slowed his horse as the ravine came into view through the falling snow. His rider spread out behind him, scanning the forest carefully. The mate bond inside his chest had grown so strong now that he could almost feel her presence like warmth through the storm. She was close, very close. Falcon leaned forward in his saddle, studying the ground. "Tracks," he said quietly. Halvar dismounted without another word. The footprints were faint but visible beneath a thin layer of fresh snow, small prints beside deeper ones. A child's tracks. Halvar's eyes darkened. The woman had not been alone in his castle after all. He followed the trail toward the ravine slowly, every instinct sharpening. When he reached the edge of the frozen stream, the scent hit him fully for the first time since she had left the castle. It wrapped around his senses like warmth after winter cold. "Mate," the word echoed, through his mind again with undeniable certainty. Halvar looked toward the rocky cave ahead where faint firelight flickered against the stone. She was there. Inside the cave, Alira felt it too. The moment Halvar stepped into the ravine, the strange tension she had been holding inside her chest since leaving the castle suddenly tightened. Her wolf stirred uneasily, recognizing the presence drawing closer through the storm. Alira's heart began to race. Kieran noticed the change instantly. "What is it?" he whispered. Alira stood slowly, her eyes fixed on the dark cave entrance. "Someone found us." Outside, Halvar approached the cave carefully. Snow swirled around him as the wind howled through the ravine. He could hear the faint crackle of fire inside. His wolf pressed forward with urgent recognition now. When he stepped inside the cave, the world seemed to pause. Alira stood on the opposite side of the fire, the child behind her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The flames between them flickered softly, casting shadows across the stone walls. Halvar's silver eyes studied her face again, just as they had in the castle hall the night before. But this time, the truth between them could no longer hide. The bond snapped into place with silent force. "You left," Halvar said quietly. Alira held his gaze. "You told me to." Halvar's jaw tightened. His eyes shifted slightly to the boy standing behind her. "Who is the child?" Alira's voice remained calm. "Someone I protect." Halvar stepped closer to the fire. The mate bond pulsed between them like a living thing. "You ran from my castle," he said slowly. "Now you stand in the middle of my territory with a child you refuse to explain." His voice lowered. "Tell me why." The fire crackled softly in the silence. Alira met his gaze without fear. "Because the moment you know the truth," she said quietly, "your entire kingdom will be in danger." The wind roared through the ravine, sending snow swirling past the cave entrance. But inside the small hollow, the fire burned steadily between them. Halvard Drakenfell stood just beyond the flames, tall and still, his silver eyes locked on the woman he had dismissed less than a day earlier. Now that he was close enough, the mate bond pulsed through him with quiet certainty. It was impossible to ignore. Every instinct in him recognized her as something far more important than the stranger who had walked into his hall. Yet she stood across the fire like a guarded shadow, one hand resting protectively on the boy behind her. Kieran clung to the back of Alira's cloak, his wide eyes studying the massive Alpha King carefully. Halvar noticed the boy immediately. There was strength in the child's gaze despite the exhaustion on his face. Something about that alone unsettled the king. Wolves raised among packs carried certain instincts early in life. This child had them. Halvar looked back to Alira. "You claim the truth would endanger my kingdom," he said quietly. "Explain." Alira hesitated, the firelight reflecting faintly in her dark eyes. "If I tell you," she said slowly, "you won't let us leave." Halvar did not deny it. "You are already standing inside my territory. You were never truly free to leave." The honesty in his tone made the air between them tighten. Alira looked down briefly at Kieran before speaking again. "The child's name is Kieran Snow." Halvar studied the boy more carefully now. The name meant nothing to him, yet the moment she said it, the child seemed to shrink slightly behind her. Alira continued quietly. "His father was the last alpha of the Frostvale pack." Halvar's expression changed immediately. Frostvale had once been one of the oldest wolf territories in the north. It had fallen 10 years earlier after a brutal war that left most of its bloodline wiped out. The surviving wolves scattered across distant lands. "The Frostvale Alpha line is extinct," Halvar said sharply. "That's what everyone believes," Alira replied. "But they missed one." She rested her hand gently on Kieran's shoulder. The boy lowered his gaze. The silence that followed felt heavy as stone. Halvar exhaled slowly as the pieces began forming in his mind. If the boy truly carried Frostvale blood, he was not simply a survivor. He was an heir, an alpha heir, and that meant any wolf hungry for power would hunt him. Halvar's voice dropped lower. "Driven Mordain." Alira's eyes flickered with surprise. You know the name? Halvar nodded once. My scouts have heard rumors. Rogue wolves gathering in the north. Mordain leading them. Alira's expression hardened. He is not gathering wolves. He is gathering armies. She looked down at Kieran again. And the moment he finds this child, he will have a blood claim to half the northern packs. Halvar stared at the boy, his mind racing through the consequences. If Draven Mordain captured the last Frostvale heir, he could force smaller packs into allegiance under threat of slaughter. Entire territories could fall. War would follow quickly. Why bring the child here? Halvar asked. Alira's lips curved in a faint, tired smile. Because Iron Fang is the only territory Mordain has never dared challenge. Halvar almost laughed at that, though there was no humor in it. You assume my protection would be automatic. Alira held his gaze steadily. I assumed a king would recognize what was at stake. Halvar remembered the moment in the Great Hall, when he had looked at her and chosen indifference instead. The memory sat uncomfortably in his chest. Behind them, the storm howled louder. Halvar stepped closer to the fire. The mate bond pulsed sharply again, reminding him that the woman standing before him was no longer simply a traveler asking protection. She was his mate, and she carried the one child in the north, capable of igniting a war that would consume every pack for miles. You should have told me last night, he said quietly. Alira's eyes hardened again. And trust the Alpha King who gave me the lowest room in his castle? Halvar had no answer for that. Suddenly one of the riders outside shouted from the ravine, Your Majesty! Halvar turned toward the cave entrance as Captain Falcon rushed inside, snow clinging to his cloak. His expression was grim. We found rogue scouts less than a mile away, Falcon said quickly. More than a dozen, and they're not alone. Halvar's eyes narrowed. How many? Falcon swallowed once before answering. At least 50 wolves moving through the forest behind them. Alira's face went pale. Mordain found us. The wind outside had grown fierce enough to turn the falling snow into a white wall across the ravine. Halvar stepped toward the cave entrance, scanning the forest carefully, while Falcon spoke quickly with the other riders. 50 rogue wolves were not a scouting party. They were a hunting pack. And if Mordain himself was nearby, the danger was far worse than anyone had expected. Halvar turned back toward the cave, where Alira stood beside the fire with Kieran. The boy clung tightly to her cloak now, fear beginning to creep across his face as the distant howls echoed through the mountains. Halvar stepped closer. How far behind you were they when you left the last town? Alira thought for a moment. 3 days. Falcon shook his head grimly. Then they've been tracking you since before you reached Iron Fang. Halvar's jaw tightened. That meant Mordain had already known about the boy before Alira ever arrived at the castle gates. Outside the cave, another howl echoed across the forest. Long, hungry, close. Kieran pressed his face into Alira's side. They found us, he whispered. Alira wrapped an arm around him protectively, but Halvar could see the tension in her shoulders. She knew what those numbers meant. Even with Iron Fang riders nearby, 50 rogues could overwhelm them in a narrow valley if the fight turned chaotic. Halvar turned toward Falcon. Send 2 riders back to the castle. Warn the pack. I want every warrior armed and ready. Falcon nodded quickly and rushed out of the cave. Alira watched Halvar carefully as he gave orders. The calm authority in his voice was very different from the indifferent king she had met in the castle hall. This was the Alpha who ruled the mountains, the wolf who commanded loyalty without hesitation. Halvar glanced back toward her. You should have trusted me. Alira gave a quiet, tired laugh. Kings are rarely known for mercy. Halvar's eyes softened slightly. Mercy isn't what you needed. His voice lowered. Protection is. Before Alira could answer, a shadow moved outside the cave entrance. A massive wolf stepped into the storm. Its fur was dark as midnight, and its yellow eyes gleamed with cruel intelligence. Behind it, more shapes moved through the snow, dozens of rogues spreading out across the ravine like a tightening noose. The wolf shifted slowly into human form, revealing a tall man with scarred skin and long black hair tangled around his shoulders. His smile was thin and cold. "Alpha King Halvar," Dreven Mordain said smoothly. "What a pleasant surprise." Halvar stepped forward slightly, placing himself between the rogue Alpha and the fire where Alira and Kieran stood. "You're far from the northern wastes, Mordain." Mordain's eyes slid past him toward the boy behind Alira. His smile widened. "Not anymore." Snow whipped around the ravine as dozens of rogues emerged from the trees behind him. The trap had already closed. Halvar's voice turned deadly calm. "You came for the child." Mordain nodded once. "The last Frostvale heir." His gaze shifted briefly toward Alira with quiet amusement. "And the woman foolish enough to protect him." Alira stepped forward beside Halvar, her expression fierce despite the danger surrounding them. "You'll never take him," Mordain laughed softly. "You misunderstand the situation." His wolves spread out slowly across the ravine, cutting off every path of escape. "I already have." The storm roared across the ravine, wind whipping snow into the air so thick it looked like smoke rising from the earth. 50 rogue wolves circled the cave now, their glowing eyes cutting through the storm like knives. Ironfang warriors stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the entrance, their claws already lengthening as their wolves pressed forward beneath the skin. Dreven Mordain stepped through the snow with slow confidence, as though he were already standing inside a victory. His gaze drifted past Halvar, straight to the child. "The last Frostvale heir," Mordain said softly, his voice filled with satisfaction. Kieran clung tighter to Alira's cloak. Halvar stepped forward. The movement was small, but every wolf in the ravine felt the power behind it. "You're trespassing in my territory," Halvar said calmly. Mordain smiled. "And you're protecting something that doesn't belong to you." His yellow eyes slid toward Alira. "Step aside, Alpha King." Snow blew between them. "Give me the boy." Halvar didn't move. Behind him, Alira could feel the tension rising in the Alpha's body, like a drawn blade. Mordain's smile widened. "You're not foolish enough to start a war over strangers." Halvar's voice was quiet, deadly quiet. "They are not strangers." Mordain tilted his head slightly. "Oh?" Halvar slowly looked back toward the cave, toward the woman standing beside the firelight. The mate bond pulsed between them with undeniable force. For the first time since the battle began, Halvar spoke the truth aloud. "She is my mate." The ravine fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Mordain blinked once. Then he laughed, a deep, mocking laugh. "The mighty Alpha King finally finds his Luna," he said, "and she arrives carrying the heir to a dead kingdom." His eyes sharpened. "That makes this easier." The transformation happened in an instant. Mordain shifted first. His massive black wolf burst forward through the storm with a thunderous snarl, aiming straight for the cave. For the child! But Halvar was already moving. His body exploded into the form of a massive silver wolf, larger than any creature in the ravine. He slammed into Mordain mid-leap. The impact shook the frozen ground. Wolves erupted into battle across the valley. Ironfang warriors collided with rogues in a storm of claws and teeth. The air filled with howls and blood. Halvar and Mordain tore across the snow like living thunder. The rogue Alpha was strong, but Halvar was something else entirely, the king of Ironfang. Each strike from the silver wolf drove Mordain backward. Still, the rogue Alpha fought, viciously snapping toward Halvar's throat again and again. Inside the cave, Alira watched the battle unfold. Ironfang wolves fought fiercely, but there were too many rogues. Too many! Kieran clung to her arm. "Alira, they're everywhere." Her heart pounded. For years she had hidden the truth, hidden the power running through her blood. But now the child she had sworn to protect stood in the middle of a war, and the Alpha fighting outside had just risked everything for her. The bond between them surged violently. Her wolf rose. The moment Elira stepped into the storm, the battle changed. Light flashed through the falling snow as her body shifted. Silver-white fur spread like moonlight across her form. The wolf that emerged beside Halvar was magnificent, larger than any Luna wolf the rogues had ever seen. Her eyes glowed bright silver. Mordain froze mid-attack. Recognition slammed across his face. "No," he whispered. "The Frostblood Luna." Halvar glanced at the silver wolf beside him. Understanding struck like lightning. The woman he had dismissed in his hall, the woman he had given the lowest room in his castle, was the last Luna of the ancient Frostvale bloodline, and now she stood beside him in battle. Mordain slowly backed away. For the first time since entering the ravine, fear touched his eyes. "You should have stayed hidden," he growled. Elira's silver wolf stepped forward beside Halvar. 2 wolves, 1 king, 1 queen. The storm howled around them. Mordain realized too late. He had just declared war on both. The battle ended faster than anyone expected. With the frost blood Luna fighting beside him, Halvar became unstoppable. They moved together with terrifying precision. Where Halvar struck with brutal power, Elira moved with impossible speed. Rogue wolves fell one by one. Ironfang warriors surged forward with renewed fury. Within minutes, the valley belonged to them. Mordain realized the truth too late. He could not win. With a furious snarl, the rogue alpha broke away and fled into the storm with the few survivors still standing. Silence slowly returned to the ravine. The storm began to fade. Ironfang wolves shifted back into human form one by one. Halvar stood in the snow, breathing heavily as his wolf receded. Across the clearing, Elira's silver wolf slowly shifted back as well. The moment she stood again in human form, Halvar walked toward her. Snow drifted softly between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Halvar said quietly, "You should have told me who you were." Elira looked at him calmly. "Would you have listened?" Halvar remembered the great hall, the laughter, the moment he had looked at her and seen nothing. His jaw tightened. No. Kieran stepped out of the cave slowly. His eyes were wide as he looked at the warriors around him. "Did we win?" he asked. Elira knelt beside him. "Yes," she said softly. Halvar looked at the boy, then back at Elira. "The child stays under Ironfang protection," he said. Elira studied him carefully. "That sounds like an order." Halvar shook his head slowly. "No." His voice softened. "It's an apology." The wind moved gently through the ravine. Halvar took one step closer. "When you came to my gates," he continued quietly, "you asked for sanctuary." His silver eyes met hers. "And I failed to see the woman standing in front of me." Elira said nothing. Halvar turned toward the distant mountains where Ironfang Castle stood against the sky. "The lowest room in my castle," he said slowly, "will remain empty from this day forward." Then he looked back at her and extended his hand. "Because the only place you belong," his voice lowered, "is beside me." Elira raised an eyebrow slightly. "Beside you where?" Halvar's answer came without hesitation. "On the throne." The Ironfang warriors watching the scene slowly bowed their heads, not to the king, but to the woman standing beside him. 2 nights earlier, the Alpha King had given a stranger the coldest room in his castle. Now the entire kingdom would bow when she entered the hall beside him. And this time, he finally saw her clearly.